Welcome back to the Prillworks channel. My name is John. In this video I'm going to show you how I made a pair of keepsake boxes using old post office box doors. Oh hi. These doors are from the 1960s, so they're pretty old. I found them on eBay, and you can also find them in local antique stores, but obviously your mileage will vary. I'm getting started by milling up the lumber. For one of them I'm going to be using this piece of walnut, which is a nice quarter sawn piece. The other one is going to be made of sapele. These boards were already jointed and planed from previous projects, so I skipped right to resawing and then taking them over to the planer to get them milled down to their rough thickness, which was about a ½ inch. Then I could get some panels glued up, which would be the bottoms of the boxes. I like to use hardwood bottoms for boxes that are this small because it doesn't take that much material and it looks much nicer than plywood. Over at the drum sander, I can get these side pieces taken down to their final thickness of a ½ inch. After ripping the boards to their final width of 3 inches, which will be the height of the box, I could take them to the crosscut sled and get them cut to their final length. This is pretty critical because you want the post office box door to fit snugly but not be too loose or too tight. You'll see a little bit later that mine was slightly too tight, but I was able to work around it. The next day I could get started cutting the joinery. I'm going to be using finger joints or box joints, and this jig is called the iBox by Incra. It's a pretty handy jig for cutting these types of joints, and since my material is a ½ inch thick, I would like the fingers to be a ½ inch thick as well, which will give it a nice square look on the ends of the corners. You could go however thick or thin you'd like, but I just think it's visually appealing this way. And one tip is to just make sure you have enough stock of the same thickness so that you can cut some test joints. I was left with this little strip, which is about a 1/16 of an inch, so I decided to rip it off so that the box would look nicer. I like to use a flat bottom grind blade to cut the grooves to hold the bottom panels. I'm making 2 passes here to make about a ½ inch wide groove, and I am cutting through grooves for both sides, which will leave a hole in the corner, but I'll show you how I fix that later, and it's hardly noticeable. Then I can get the panels sanded down to their final thickness so that they fit into the grooves perfectly. After sanding the inside of these pieces up to 220 grit, I can get started with the glue up. I use a brush to apply the glue to all the fingers, and you can see that I have blue tape applied to the inside of these joints, which will combat any squeeze out. The fingers should go together pretty snugly because the glue does swell the joint, and you should account for this when you are sizing out the fingers back at the table saw. And then when you do install the bottom panel, I like to add a little bit of glue on the short sides just in the middle to keep the panel secure, but I don't apply any glue anywhere else because the panel does need to expand and contract with the seasonal humidity. I taped some wooden cawls to the sides of these pieces so that I could apply the clamping pressure evenly, and then I could check for square, and the glue up was done. Here I'm filling that through groove on the long side of the board with an offcut from this same project. This way it'll match perfectly, and I'll show you a picture a little later to show you how it turned out. To sand the fingers flush, I used 80 grit sandpaper and then moved on to a 150 and then eventually 220, making sure to apply even pressure at the corners so that I didn't round them over at all. I like to include some dividers in the box so that whatever you put in here doesn't just roll around like crazy. So I had some ½ inch stock here, getting it measured and cut so that it fits snugly. I'll have 2 pieces that meet with a half lap joint, and so here I am cutting one of the longer pieces in the sapele box, sneaking up on the fit with a crosscut blade, and this depth of cut is just exactly half of the height of this piece. You can see me test fitting each cut until I finally get to a nice snug fit. On to the mini crisis I almost had. Both of the boxes ended up being a little too small, by about a 32nd of an inch, to hold these post office box doors. So I ended up sanding and eventually moving on to an angle grinder with a 40 grit disc and just taking as much material as I needed to until these things fit nicely. I used one of these fancy right angle attachments to drill some holes for screws, and then I can move on to finish. I'm using a simple walnut oil finish, which I've had on hand for a little while. It's pretty easy to apply. It's just a simple wipe on, wipe off, and it leaves a pretty matte finish and close to the wood feel, which I like for a project like this. And it's also easy to reapply if it's ever needed. And these are the final boxes. I think I prefer the walnut one just because of the straight grain, but the sapele has some nice figure in it as well. You can see how the divider works. There's 4 little compartments, and if you do make one of these, make sure that the dividers are not too tall to where the box lid cannot slide in properly. I think a project like this makes a great gift because it mixes a little bit of old with some new. The first time I made one of these was actually a gift for my wife on our wedding day, and it was a big hit. I actually got lucky that the door that I found had our original anniversary on the glass, so that worked out perfectly. Anyways, I wanted to show you guys how those plugs worked out. You can see here that they're very tough to see, and if I wouldn't have pointed them out, you might not ever see them. This is a good alternative if you don't want to make stopped grooves. I don't have a router table, so making stopped grooves can be a bit of a pain, especially on small work pieces like this. So making a through groove and plugging it up later is a pretty good alternative. Anyways, here's some more finished photos of the boxes. Thanks for watching.